as we're used to doing here, sort of not meddling with the formalities, no need for icebreakers. We jump right in. And the book, Sexuality Beyond Consent, the title of the book, it places your project, Avgi, within the context of an ongoing debate that surrounds consent. And this debate highlights the intersection of the personal and the political realms, as well as the convergence of identity and politics in what some call identity politics. And I wanted to ask you, for those listeners and for myself as well, that might be unfamiliar with recent developments in the discourse of consent within this scope, I was wondering if you could introduce us to this emerging, let's say, field of political thought. Tell us a little bit about it. Safely land us in this topic.
Yeah, I don't know about the safety part, but we'll see where we go. Thank you for setting the stage for that, Leon. As you say, kind of like what is the modern discourse, the contemporary discourse of consent? I think that it's also important to put this in a historical context, which is that consent has been kind of like a very big issue, both in conversations in feminism, so not so much psychoanalytic feminism, kind of like through the kind of like second wave onwards, and especially more recently with Me Too, and has also been a very important, more like approached more, I would say, kind of like at an angle topic in some critical race theory and queer of color critique, especially in thinking about the question of consent for vis-a-vis kind of like histories of enslavement and coloniality. Psychoanalysis, however, has not engaged with this critical literature around consent. So just to say some things that are probably going to be obvious to everyone, but just to kind of like frame the project, especially with the Me Too movement and kind of like the rise of different kinds of feminisms, we have more interest and recently more attention paid to questions of sexual harassment and sexual violation, and also the sensitive aspects of this, which have to do with nonlinear temporality, women, but not only female identified persons coming forth and naming violations, sometimes recent and sometimes of many years ago. And certainly feminism has fought very hard to establish a place from which consent can be taken seriously, so that the vulnerability of the positional vulnerability through gender or other categories in an interpersonal encounter can be taken seriously and treated ethically. So these are the hopes and dreams that have been in a way deposited into the notion of affirmative consent, that presumes that two people, they get together, they have like discussions about what the boundaries are of what will not be done, and the idea is of like respecting the limits, or at the very least having a sense of when limits have been crossed, precisely because clear lines have been drawn. Of course, from a psychoanalytic perspective, this notion of affirmative consent makes very little sense. There's nothing that supports the notion that psychic time will follow this kind of like clear chronological, I tell you now what I will want later, or I later say no, as if kind of like you're in possession of yourself always. So I've tried to critique this notion of affirmative consent, leaning also in other discourses. Certainly, there's been a lot of critique on affirmative consent from sexuality studies, kink studies, and critical studies. Joel Fischel's book on the age of consent and screw consent has been kind of like really influential in the field. But psychoanalysis has lagged behind, as our field tends to do in a variety of different ways. And what I wanted to do is both bring this conversation into psychoanalysis, but also subjective to a certain kind of analytic reading, where we have a chance of being reminded that the conditions of assent or dissent are not are also subject to forces that are not always within our command. Not to obviously excuse perpetrators or to make room for people to deny kind of like maltreatment of sexual partners, but to speak about the kinds of vulnerabilities that arise in the encounters between two people. So I've made kind of like some of the critiques that anybody who's thinking analytically would expect about how trauma erupts on a scene of an encounter without being able to be anticipated, the kinds of the frozenness to that, that may not permit somebody to speak from within a scene, the fact that that consenting to any kind of encounter also brings other things with it that neither party may have anticipated ahead of time. So there's a lot of different issues about consent, but the one that interested me had to do more with how, if we take as a relative given, and that's a very big if, I'm aware that this is a huge assumption to be asking people to make. If we start with a premise of an encounter between two people who are not trying to control each other or violate each other or just get what they want, but are exposed to each other, including each other's desire and each other's unexpected, kind of like what unexpectedly arises the encounter, how else might we think about consent? And I start my book with this really powerful vignette from a clinical moment where a patient is describing to me an encounter she was having with a lover. And she has negotiated with her lover how her partner will slap her in the course of an erotic scene. And they talk about it, they agree on it, they do all the right things as far as affirmative consent is concerned. And the encounter starts, and my patient tells me that when her lover slaps her, she, meaning my patient, who in the book I call Carmen is slapped by her partner Ava, and she feels really astonished at the moment of the slap because, as she says to me later in the session, she said, it was really an amazing slap. It was the right kind of force. It was the right type. She had the right facial expression, the right distance. It hit her at the right part of her face. And she says to me that what she thought she had consented to was a mediocre slap. And what she got instead is this slap that she describes as exquisite. So interestingly, her response to this exquisite slap is to safeguard and stop the encounter, which is, to begin with, a very different set of parameters with which to think about an erotic situation and the conditions in an erotic situation than we usually do when the idea of consent comes forth, where we think about boundaries and who respected them. Or, like, Carmen is not concerned. She doesn't think that Eva violated anything. What she is responding to is that something got stirred up in her in response to this slap that was both invited and completely unanticipated in its texture and its flavor, that Carmen realizes she is not able to open up herself to. So I start there to alert us to the fact that consent also has to do with an internal dimension, with what it is we are allowing ourselves to sink into, or to be pulled into, or to be seduced into by virtue of the desires that open up in us and the appetites that open up in us that we did not anticipate ahead of time.
Yes, it's very clear that, right at the outset, you explain that consent is a multifaceted concept that has distinct forms. And you make this distinction between affirmative consent that you've said a bit about, and then another term that you coin called limit consent that has to do with what you're actually developing in the book. And I hope it will be the lion's share of our talk today. But before delving into your theoretical framework and spending some time there, I wanted you to maybe clarify. Well, you've said about what affirmative consent is, but maybe give us another clarification and also clarify what is your critique of this notion. And this is something I found in the book and was interesting to me. You said it is not a useful concept, you write in the book.
Yes.
So in other words, if you could tell us about affirmative consent, and then tell us, what do you identify as the blind spots of affirmative consent, the ones you highlight in your book?
Yeah. I mean, briefly speaking, affirmative consent is the idea that two people get together, they plan some aspects of an encounter, limits are drawn, and then kind of like if communication is clear, like people take responsibility for communicating what they want, what they don't want. And then there's also an attentiveness to, or so affirmative consent imagines, an attentiveness to aspects of the encounter that, whether the person said yes to them or not, if they're not enthusiastically and in an ongoing way assented to, then one has to either stop and get consent or realize that this was not within the domain of what was negotiated, and therefore you can't go there because the other person may or not be able to say no because they are under kind of like the duress of psychic conditions that may make it hard for them to articulate their desire or articulate their limit. Now, obviously, this kind of like very perimetered way of thinking about consent has been offered in the hopes that it will protect people from being victimized, that it will give clear communicative lines along which people can negotiate their interpersonal encounters, but also that that it would make it clear for people who after the fact wonder about whether something happened with or against their desire, to be able to mark whether something was violative or not. The fantasy was, and affirmative consent's promise still is, that if you negotiate sexual encounters through affirmative consent, the safety and also pleasure can be guaranteed. And of course, that has spectacularly failed. And that's where I get into my critique of affirmative consent, which is that among many, many other things, is that desire is both emergent and unconsciously conflicted, that there are so many things which in our appearing before each other, there are appetites that open up, including appetites that we do not necessarily like about ourselves, but which in the heat of the moment can extract a certain kind of attractive pull that we may or not feel moved to respond to, that this securitizing, and I use the word security here to kind of like link some of that to Foucault and the notion of surveillance and the work that he does around the kind of the productive power versus the kind of like the repressive power of desire, also arises in the contact with another person. And kind of like this, I mentioned this earlier as well, there's this chronology, linear chronology that affirmative consent imagines, when in the contact with another human being, we find ourselves through temporalities that are quite recursive or iterative, return us to earlier times, and do not just return us, sometimes they kind of like slap us with something that lands on us with a force that was unexpected. So whereas affirmative consent is preoccupied with safety and with how to guard the self against the other's incursion and violation, I'm proposing the concept of limit consent, not to substitute affirmative consent. I don't imagine that we'll ever have to we'll ever get rid of having to think about how protection. But I am interested in what that forecloses in our encounters with one another. And I offer limit consent as a way of thinking about what it means to step into an experience with another, not guarding, but in fact risking the self.
So let's explore this concept then, which is a very central concept in your book. And I'll just tease out a question after reading the book and enjoying it. what I identified in your argument is that limit consent identifies or signifies an encounter with an experience that pushes the boundaries of the self. And you even speak about the fact that it leads to its fragmentation. And what I found interesting, and correct me if I'm wrong in assuming this, I saw that you are proposing an ethics, in a way, that seeks to embrace a state that you call overwhelm, where the sexual drive becomes excessive and then challenges the coherence of the ego. So it questions all of these established narratives that we have on ourselves. But then you also speak about the fact that it facilitates new translations. And here you use Laplanche's terminology here when describing that. So I might ask you at this point to tell us about limit consent, but particularly if you could emphasize the importance that you find in shattering the ego and reconstructing it within the context of limit consent. Yeah. And also, why do you, and this is an interesting question that steps a little bit outside of the realm of the clinic. So I was wondering if you could tell more about why you believe this process holds political implications that extend beyond its therapeutic and clinical value.
This is such a great question, and it has so many branches. So I'll try to address them, but please bring me back if I've left something out. I've taken some notes that I'm going to look at. So
take your time.
So you were talking about limit consent as pushing the boundaries of the self, and I would start with saying this: limit consent does not push the boundaries of the self. It has a chance of pushing the boundaries of the self, because you see, for example, in my description of Carmen's experience, Carmen experiences this pushing and she refuses it. She says words and she steps out of it. So limit consent cannot do anything in and of itself. Limit consent is an opportunity, and one either steps into it and takes the risk of it or doesn't. And we can talk about what circumstances and what conditions enable or disable that possibility. But let's say for a moment, let's consider a subject who is actually willing to step into the fray of that kind of tension, encountering something which in the book I describe in great detail has to do with a sexual drive, which for Laplanche is also commensurable with the sexual unconscious. So to inch closer, or rather to not recoil from the intensities that come up in limit consent, part of what is risked on that border is also an encounter with one's own unconscious. And I should say here that when I talk in my talk today, when I use the term unconscious, I use it very specifically in the Laplanchian term sense of an unconscious that is completely resistant to symbolization. I'm not talking about a secondarily repressed unconscious that houses unacceptable memories or contradictory ideas or painful experiences that one could, or intergenerationally transmitted experiences. I'm talking about an unconscious that has become unconscious by virtue of the fact that it resists organization, psychic organization. So that is, energetically speaking, because it is constituted through forces that are not bound and is in fact governed by principles of unbinding, every contact that the ego might make, which is a more bound domain of the psyche, with the unconscious threatens the ego's integrity. Now, in a lot of psychoanalytic schools, the question of strengthening the ego or making sure that the ego does not get overwhelmed by these kinds of forces seems to be more the focus. At least that's how I was trained. But my book wonders, it asks this following question, what are we missing out on when we care so much about safety, which is not unimportant, but which right now has become the unthought given, as if safety is the end all and be all of psychic life. What do we miss out on when we do not tread into the terrain of what happens when the sexual drive escalates and it doesn't lead to containment. And I have theorized that what happens, that whereas when the sexual instinct, Freud's sexual instinct escalates, like it reaches a plateau, you have orgasm and then you have a denouement and then here you go again, rinse and repeat. But even though we have been warned against the excesses of the sexual drive, other than writings that speak about the concern of analysts about acting out or disorganization or a psychotic breakdown, we don't have a lot of theoretical models that help us think about what happens if you do follow the escalation of the sexual drive. And in some ways, that's the territory that limit consent is kind of like risking. And in my work, I argue that part of what happens if it escalates enough beyond the boundedness of the ego and beyond what can be regulated is that the ego can come undone. And I use Leo Bersani's work around the shattering of the ego to speak about, like, and this is work, I'll speak first about what Leo Bersani has done and then what I've added. Leo Bersani kind of like started this work thinking about kind of like gay men and sexuality, especially at the time of AIDS, to think about kind of like the shattering of the ego and how, however passive and powerless that might seem, he argued that there's a certain kind of that pleasure and a certain kind of power team, psychic power, like subjectively experienced power, kind of like teams around those sites. Thinking with Laplanche, what I argue is that what comes undone when the ego shatters is that the tether between psychic representation and the sexual unconscious, the enigmatic, which can never be fully culled by meaning or representation, is that these tethers begin to come undone and the ego liquidates. Now, of course, the ego will very quickly like rush in, just like when you have a gash in the skin, like the immune system will rush to that site and kind of like make sure that the wound closes. And the ego has that kind of response. When a rupture happens, its work is to come back together and close it up. And the hope is that after these states of overwhelm, when the ego comes back together, it can come back together in a different way, and hopefully in a way that is both better than before, but also more, not just more functional for the person, but also having like an enlarged scope of possibility. Now, you were asking about the political implications of this idea, and maybe I should say a little bit about that to clarify what the stakes are of this argument, which is that when I discuss Laplanche's theory in the first chapter of the book, because I've written this book so that it can be read by people who are not familiar with Laplanche. It's challenging, but all the ideas are in there. Laplanche argues that in the original enigmatic encounter between adult and child, the child ends up being the recipient of kind of like not just messages from the adult, but also an enigmatic surcharge that the child then has to deal with. And that issues from the adult sexual unconscious. To cope with that, to cope with the strain of that enigmatic implant, the child translates, is the word that he, in my opinion, problematically used to talk about how the child has to generate basically a fantasy, generate kind of like some symbolizing capacity in order to be able to bind this thing that is ontologically opaque with representations so that it comes to become meaningful. Now, Laplanche, and I think this is one of his most interesting interventions in psychoanalysis, has a really fascinating idea about how that translation happens. And he says the following. He says, in order to translate, the child will innovate by choosing sounds too conscious, and this is not a conscious process, but let's say choosing for now, selecting from the world that the adults have presented to her, codes that she then combines idiosyncratically to generate these translations. Laplanche calls the world from which these codes are drawn the mythosymbolic world of myths, myths, like Greek myths, kind of like Greeks, not just Greek myths, but mythologies that circulate in the social realm, including mythologies of, I would add, binary gender, or the mythology of whiteness, or the mythology of heterosexuality. So the infant leans on those codes and assembles them idiosyncratically to craft her translations. The ego then comes to be as the outcome of these uses of these found objects that are not created by the child. They're out there in the social world, but they are put together in a pretty idiomatic way. And therefore they come to feel ours, because even though they are starting with materials that are not of our making, the fact that we assemble them makes them feel like they're ours. So our gender feels like it belongs to us. So, you may feel like, no, but I'm really a man. Like I've always felt that, even though kind of like your masculinity is also the creation of kind of like, it's a translation based on the codes that's out there. So part of what happens when the ego shatters is that these links between the representations and the codes that are out there in the mythosymbolic realm and the sexual unconscious momentarily shatters, and new connections can be made. And what that means is that kind of like there's tremendous political potential for how the self can expand and get rewritten, not in a way that is untrue to the original self, not as a deviation from the previous self, but actually as a new becoming.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, so I think that was quite clarifying remarks here in terms of Laplanchian theory, and maybe we can then take this potential and see how it unravels in the clinic.
Mm-hmm.
You're a psychoanalyst, a practicing psychoanalyst, and you speak about, you highlight even in the book the parallels between the practice of limited consent and the role of the analyst.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you basically note that also in analysis, the analysand, even if only implicitly, yes, anticipates being pushed to their limits. In this sense, I would like you to delve deeper into this hypothesis and discuss how limit consent aligns, or let's say the ethics that you describe in association with limit consent. How do they align with the ethics of psychoanalysis? While also, if you could clarify where it introduces novelty, because for me, of course, my acquaintance with Laplanche is I do have acquaintance with him, but as I said, my formation is of another orientation. But I can definitely identify with what you're saying here right now in this sense. So I would like you to specifically say how we can incorporate limit consent into contemporary psychoanalytic practice in ways that are different than previous approaches that we have in psychoanalysis in this.
Yeah. Let me start with saying something that is may sound a little bit provocative. I don't think that there is a way for me to direct people as to how to do that. And actually, I would personally very much resist the invitation, which I understand, kind of like for you, it comes from a place of wanting to understand. So what do we do with these ideas? But I would actually urge whoever becomes interested in these ideas to not take the path of like, how do we apply them? Because then they run the risk of becoming their own prescriptions, and they lose whatever radical and transformational power they may have. And here's what I mean by this. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that patients anticipate the pushing per se. I think that patients come. I mean, I'm not a Lacanian, but I know a little bit of Lacan, and I would say people come to treatment hoping that nothing changes. That kind of like the symptom is magically removed, but nothing really changes. Mm-hmm. But so in many ways, however, I would argue that clinical work is, whether we like it or not, whether we think about this or not, this way, it is premised on limit consent, like especially analytic work, deep, ongoing analytic work is premised on limit consent. And kind of like this, here's what I mean by that. Like if a patient walks into your office and says to you, I am here to talk about my relationship difficulties, but I do not want to talk about how I was beaten by my father as a child. Like, it happened, I'm aware of it, I'm aware that it makes me distress people, but I'm just here to talk about my lover. There is no trained analyst who would say, well, actually, we will talk about the abuse, right? Even though there's also not trained analyst who expects that you will not talk about the abuse. Like, you know that there's going to be ways, kind of like, most likely there's going to be some connection. Now, if you were to say to the patient on the level of affirmative consent, you don't want to go there, we won't go there. You're contracting with something that you actually have no plan of agreeing to do. With some patients, to even intimate that those boundaries can change in the course of the work would feel too frightening. So there are some patients to whom you retrospectively know that you might be able to say, look, we don't have to go there, but it might become relevant. Some people come in and they're so visibly traumatized and physically closed off that you know that to say even that is going to feel like a violation, and it's going to feel so unsafe that they may not be able to stay in the treatment. So in some ways, we start with the conditions that the patient presents to us, not fully expecting to respect them, which is not the same thing as saying that we expect to violate them. It's not like, also anybody who's like any psychoanalyst or clinician who's worth their salt is not going to be like, well, we really need to talk about this, or we haven't talked about it for 3 months, but enough already, we need to get to it. Nobody's going to do that. But we are working in a way that we are hoping that during the course of the work, through some natural shifting of the boundaries as trust develops, but also because we will learn enough about the patient and enough about what's happening between us to be able to push, that there will be situations where we might test something, kind of like put something out there and see if there's a way to go further than the patient had authorized at the beginning, further than the patient might authorize if we were to ask them now, are you ready now to have that conversation? And this is the whole art of psychoanalysis. And that means that the analyst who is working in this way is also taking a risk. And this is part of the domain of limit consent. And the risk that you take with limit consent is not just the risk of the other person feeling hurt. And of course, like if a patient, like I think many of us have sat with patients where you ask a question, they're like, I really told you I didn't want to go there. I'm really upset. And then the rest of the session is about how upset they felt that you even tried to go in that direction. That patient is absolutely right to be upset with you, right? So it's not like you take the risk, and if the patient cannot tolerate it, then look at their pathology that they can't tolerate it. The whole concept of working with limit consent presumes that you are willing to take the responsibility of the unintended effect that it could create. And this has tremendous implications also about thinking about whiteness, and the ways in which white people fall apart when their own crossings get marked. And then instead of being able to take responsibility for that not unintentional or not consciously, I would say, intended effects, people basically barricade themselves around their ego understandings of themselves and refuse to participate in the conversation. But to go back to the clinical domain, so there are, now if this idea that you start hoping that boundaries will shift in the course of the work and you'll be able to go to places that you hadn't been able to go, this is part of what creates the intensity of the analytic relationship and the intensity of the work that can happen in the consulting room. If for a moment we thought about this in a sexual parallel, if you were meeting with somebody to have a kind of intimate encounter and this person said, I do not want to be anally penetrated. And you were thinking, you know what, they say no now, but who knows, during the course of the encounter, they may want it. And then you'd try to insert something anally and they get upset. I mean, that's beginning to sound rapey. right? This is a whole other. So I'm pointing this out to say, kind of like, so here is the paradigm of affirmative consent and how limited it is in thinking about psychoanalytic connections, kind of like the work in this analytic dyad. But this is also how we become to see that those limits and how something gets not violated or trespassed, but worked on in the course of the relationship and in the course of the deepening of the work also creates really intense intimacies and intensities for which the analyst is responsible, even though she's not guilty for them. And I think that these are two important kind of like considerations. To be responsible for something is not to feel guilty. It's not to be guilty for it, because the other person's constitution also brings something into play. But it's also not about stepping out of it and saying, well, I didn't intend that. This patient is too traumatized. Like, it wasn't me. They just did not have the capacity for symbolization. I mean, we certainly all have heard clinicians who accuse the patient for the ways in which that the patient, whose job it is not to symbolize and process, their job is to be a patient. It is our job to do something different. So in that respect, like, I'm not making an argument for limit consent in the consulting room. I'm making an argument for how limit consent is already there. And it is we clinicians who turn away from it, because it is we who are frightened by the intensities that can arise in the analytic relationship, and by the responsibility that comes with working clinically.
Yes, I very much agree here. And we see many strands of theoretization trying to put the blame on the analysand, as you say. It is resistance on the behalf of the analysand. It is a projection, whereas many times the resistance is on the side of the analyst, if not all the times. Let me try and take this one more step further. We don't have to meddle on
Leon, can I add one more thing?
Yes, please, go ahead.
So in some ways, and this goes back to the question that you were asking at the beginning about the different ethics that I am speaking to in terms of psychoanalytic work, very much in keeping with Laplanche's model. Laplanche insists that the clinician's work, the analyst's work, is not the work of interpretation. It's not the work of binding. It's not the work of organizing or synthesizing, which for those of us who were trained, as I was, to think about the ego's integrative function, kind of like how the synthetic function of the ego is what makes us healthy and steady and also productive and also kind of like likely to love and work and marry and have children and produce, all of that stuff. Those of us who were trained to think of the strong ego as kind of like the outcome, the ideal outcome of psychoanalytic treatment, will feel very startled by his insistence that, and this is a phrase from him that I really love, that the analyst is the artisan of unbinding. That kind of like the artistry and also the risk of psychoanalysis for the analyst as well as for the patient, even though these are both there, even though they're asymmetrical, is that the analyst's job is to create the conditions for, not to unbind, not to kind of like push the patient, but to create the conditions for unbinding to become possible. And that is really a very different way of thinking about clinical work than work that is about stitching somebody together so that they can go back out into the world and have the relationships that are expected of us, including productive relationships with bosses and creation and so on and so forth.
Yes, it's the ego as the product of capitalism. It is a functioning ego, and
heterosexuality and cisness and whiteness. All of these, I think, have some kind of like they're all converging around the same core.
It is. I think it is Freud that said that the ego is not a master even in his own house, and I think that Lacan was saying that the ego is strong enough, especially for those neurotic patients. Their complaints demonstrate exactly the fact that it is strong enough. And I think I've told you just before we began that I think there's a certain let's say, implicit or quiet alliance between Laplanche and Lacan in this sense of this ethics. So again, if we proceed on this line, and then we can go venture in other domains. We don't have much more time before we let the audience ask some questions. The idea of disinvesting in ego identifications as part of the analytic process treatment, I think is something that I identify in this notion of shattering, unbinding, and very much agree with, particularly in working with neurotic patients. But it may not be applicable in the same way when we work with psychotic analysis. So, in psychosis, sometimes our focus is on helping establish a stable position within the social bond and not risk the collapse of the ego. And considering this, I wanted to ask you, maybe the last questions on the domain of the clinical work, if you think that there is actually a limit to this kind of ethics, the ethics of limit consent on a clinical level, and would we be potentially risking let's say, individuals that experience psychosis, would we be risking them if we work with them in this type of setting?
Yeah, I really love this question. For a while, I worked in inpatient units with adults and then with children, and I also worked in forensics with people who had been adjudicated not guilty by reason of insanity, having committed terrible crimes in the course of their psychotic breaks. So, this is a domain that I am not unfamiliar with. But I would actually go in the opposite direction than you are suspecting, perhaps, which is to say that in many ways, psychotic patients, part of what constitutes their psychosis is a very rigid binding of the ego. And we see this, for example, in paranoia. Paranoia is not a disorganization. It's a very, very rigid organization around materials that we do not think accord with reality. But it is not a disorganized state. In fact, it is an attempt to deal with disorganization with a pretty tight narrative encasement. And, one of the first things that you're trained to understand when you're working with inpatient populations is that you don't argue with a delusion. And part of why you don't argue with a delusion has to do precisely with translation, because you will not talk anybody out of their translation. So when I was saying earlier, translations come to feel not just egosyntonic, but actually the very part of the self, it's what makes you feel at home, it's what makes you feel safe. We can begin to think about how holding on to, say, for example, whiteness has the same kind of, or one's own solidity of their cisgender, has the same psychotic enclave as paranoid delusions. Now, this is not to say that our job in psychoanalysis to break down people's whitenesses or heterosexualities, some of these will come up as a course of the work anyway. But what I'm trying to challenge here is this way that we have of thinking about people who are mentally ill, especially severely mentally ill, as not having egos. I would say that in some ways their egos are in overdrive. And that when you said, can we risk those patients? I would say two things to that. To some degree, I'm saying that all psychoanalysis is a risk and that neurotic patients are risked too, but we are not the ones risking them. And this takes us back to what you were saying earlier about disinvesting as analysts, that part of what we risk is ourselves. Mm-hmm. Part of what we have to be able to risk are our own understandings of ourselves, of what we do in the consulting room, because in the clearing of being exposed to an unbinding experience in the patient or in oneself, oftentimes this can happen together in the transference in the consulting room. Part of what is needed at moments like this is to say things that we're not trained to say, that our supervisors have not said to us, that are not in the books, that are not in the manuals, that are not in Freud. We are forced to experiment. And I say this not to be nonchalant and say, oh, we should go off experimenting. It's not about experimenting on the patient, but entering the seriousness of the experimental domain, that is to try to be with a person while they're in the process of inventing something new and while we're inventing something new. And analysts who do not risk themselves this way are analysts who walk in having a sense of how the process works, what we're supposed to do. You interpret here and not here. I was trained at some point to interpret what is preconscious, but not unconscious, because it's too much. You work with a client and you have to go right for the unconscious anxiety. These are kind of like, I think, different ways of answering the question of how do we feel bound in the consulting room? And that's what I think the question of technique ultimately promises us. And I think it overpromises us. And we have many examples of where that falls short.
Yes, I agree. I think that in this type of ethics, the analyst cannot know. The analyst maybe it can only be supposed to know. And we are to pay, and as you say, to risk. We risk our own person for the sake of the transference, because we do not rely on our own preconceptions and ideas. We risk our words because we borrow them for an intervention here and there. Even when we want to speak, when you really want to say something, you have to remain quiet. And this is, again, something that Lacan says. We also risk our being in order for this to materialize. So
I think that part of what's very tricky about what you just put is how serious it is. And I say this in the like when you were talking earlier about like Freud having said like the ego is not master in its own house, like there is a way in which we can proceed with each other and in the consulting room as if we know that, and one has to be arrested by it and astonished by it each time. Like if you know you don't know, you don't know you don't know, you just know something else. And in some ways, this has to be wrested from yourself. And I mean, from the analyst self. The analyst has to wrest that from herself at each encounter. That's why I think the notion of technique, even that can become very reified. Like, oh, we don't know, we walk in not knowing. But if you walk in knowing that you don't know, you know something. And that's not the kind of ethic that we're talking about here.
Well, this is a certain paradox you are referring to here. Huh? The liar cannot tell us that he does not lie. So what is it then? I mean, what is the positioning of the analyst in this domain that enables this ethics to your view then in the book?
Well, in the book, I talk about kind of like two aspects of this. The one is kind of like working with critical philosophy. I talk about the bending of the will, that like there is a way in which kind of like we can try to push back against the part of ourselves that wants to stay safe, that wants to kind of like stay organized, sometimes by leaning actually on interventions from outside of psychoanalysis that show us how arbitrary bindings are. I mean, this is what's so fascinating about translation. Translation is the most sincere form of hypocrisy. Like it kind of like translation promises us that what we see in the world is how the world is. And part of what happens in ego shattering is kind of like a momentary startle into how arbitrary how arbitrary the social materials from which the world is made are. That doesn't mean that we can remake them at will right now, but it does mean that there's something that is historically contingent, and that if everything is historically contingent, it means that everything is changeable, not at will, not kind of like with the power of one's willfulness or decision-making, or this is not the neoliberal subject that takes the reins of subjectivity and kind of like you select your gender, you select your life, and you go out and live it. That's not what I'm talking about. But there is like a radical contingency that is at the heart of the ego's consistency. And that's what is at stake. So the Laplanchian analyst, Dominique Scarfoni, whose work I've been really inspired by, and kind of like I'm very influenced by, talks about Lyotard's notion of passabilité, and kind of like how it is the analyst's passability and her hovering between this place of passivity and activity, of allowing something to come in and actually contaminate you, infect you, take you over, kind of like a place of being besieged by the other, that is critical to this practice.
See, and I mean, this is, I think, a point of strength in the book. You refer to many philosophies, many philosophical framework, and I think it enriches your argument and also is an opportunity for people to read further. So you mentioned Foucault, Bataille, and others as well. So we have just a few minutes. I actually have much more to ask you, but maybe I wanted to ask you about this notion of exigent sadism. But you know what? Maybe we can leave it to the questions. Maybe you can plug it somehow in one of the answers to the other participants. Something that really touched my heart was your recounting this powerful experience of being deeply affected by a specific theatrical performance in the book. And this raises this intriguing discussion about the, let's say, we might call it therapeutic potential, maybe, the potential for change that we can identify in aesthetic experiences and experiences in the field of art. And it suggests that, well, the transformative effect or that is sometimes observed in psychoanalysis is not limited to this analyst-analysand relationship, but can also occur in relation to an artistic object. So I'd like to, if you could elaborate on how you view this profound impact on one's subjectivity that you identify in the aesthetic experience.
Yeah.
And maybe if you wish, you can tell us a little bit about your own insights or experience of watching this play called Slave Play that you described.
I'm going to start from there because it so links to what you're talking about, which is that, in a few years ago, I was gifted a ticket to go see this play, and I went and watched it without knowing anything about it. This is how I like to be exposed to art. I don't read reviews. I don't want to know that the plot is. That makes for a lot of boring viewing and stuff that I'm not interested in. But it's really worth preserving the fact that sometimes you're exposed at something at the limit of your understanding. And it was like that with Slave Play. My contact with it was really profound and catalytic. I saw this play, and then I became obsessed with it. I started seeing it again, going to discussions that the production was offering, where theater goers could get together and discuss the ideas. And then there was a very particular moment, like a few months into my preoccupation, where I realized that I was not just going because I enjoyed it. Like I really could not go. I was like really kind of like I was caught in something. It was kind of like being sick or infected with a virus. I just could not resist it. And I started like realizing there were things I had to do. And, like very busy. I teach. I have a full practice. I write. And it in the aftermath, I looked back and I'm astonished that it didn't cost me more than it did to have become so kind of like to have stepped into the vertigo of that experience. Because when I came to that fork, I felt like I could almost make a decision. Do I pull back or do I just throw myself into it? And decision is not exactly accurate either, but I decided to kind of like throw myself into it. And I describe this in the book in great detail. I describe the play and what happens in the play. It's a really very fascinating play that works on the principle of unbinding. It basically barrages you with more and more intensity, gives you a momentary respite, and then it goes at you again. And it stops at the side of unbinding. And therefore, it does not work in an Aristotelian cathartic way. This is not like Greek theater of like the Greek theater of like catharsis, and something comes to be understood and you see something represented. It's more, it's a play, as is some other art and some other performance that works on a more Bataillean concept of expenditure and of kind of like energetic effervescence, and gets more and more and more until it becomes too much. Some people felt too much, I don't like it. Some people felt really traumatized by it. There were actually petitions to shut it down. And I felt, like others did, really excited by it. And I use the word excitement to also kind of like tie to the sexual, not to say that it was a turn on, but to say that it was kind of like the excitations of these intensities actually created a lot of energies for many of us who became, I was not the only one who started watching it again. So I'm trying to, in the book, talk about aesthetic experience then, not just in the sense of the experience of watching art and feeling transformed by art, but rather than attend to the formal aspects of a piece of art that then speak to us or touch part of us that we were unaware of or we were not connected with, and now they bring them to the surface, and now you can think about them or feel really affected by them, and then go to your analyst and talk about them. I speak more about the aesthetic as that which like exercises a kind of what I call ethical sadism on us, kind of like breaking up the order of representation. So, for example, the playwright in describing this play says one of his few stage directions is that nobody in the play should work to make the audience comfortable. And the director of the play withholds an intermission, so you actually have to sit through the whole play without any break, which kind of like builds and builds the intensity. And when he talks about it, he says, if you came to a play that is termed slave play, it has to cost you something to see it. We're not going to let you go to the bathroom and feel relieved. You want to leave? You can leave. That has a cost. You want to stay and watch it? That's going to cost you too. And he says in a line that I've actually given a lot of thought to, he says, if you stay, I want you to choke on this a little bit. The material is very difficult. It has to do with interracial kind of like eroticism, but also a lot of the playing on kind of like racial tropes and racial humiliations and kind of like white exploitations. It recycles all the tropes and all the stereotypes. And there is a kind of way in which you are, especially if you're white identified as I am, it requires you to be subjected to something at the limit of your understanding, which rouses so many feelings that your ego, it's like you don't have enough time to process it. It comes at you. And the play ends in what I have come to think of as the site of enigma. Like it just drops you. It stops amidst something that is very disturbing. And then you're kind of like left, I think, magnificently so, left to have to think about it again and again. So that's the way in which it's not cathartic. It doesn't tell you what you're supposed to make of it, but it does really disturb you.
Yes, that was a very good answer. I think people asked about the play. It's called Slave Play, but I've been informed that it's not playing anymore. So maybe at some point there'll be a rerun. But you can read about it in your book, and I think there's at least half a chapter devoted to it, even more.
Oh, there's 2 chapters devoted to it, in keeping with my obsession.
So even 2 chapters. So if you're interested, you can read it about it in the book. But I think, unfortunately, I have to shut up right now and open the stage for the audience. So anyone at any point that would like to ask a question, just raise your virtual hand, and then you'll be popped on my screen.